Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Caramoor's first ever Caramoor conversation. Tonight, my name is Kathy Schumann. I'm the artistic director at Caramoor, and we're talking today about Bartók string quartets in honor of the cycle that we will be presenting starting on Sunday by our string quartet in residence this year, the Callisto Quartet. And I'm joined here tonight by the quartet who are at home in Texas remotely, and our special guest host and moderator of this talk, Ara Guzelimian, who is the artistic director of the Ojai Festival, outgoing provost and dean of the Juilliard School, but whom I also used to work with at Carnegie Hall years ago when he was artistic advisor. So it's great to be connecting with Ara again. And I'm just going to turn it over to Ara, and I'll see you at the end of the talk. Take it away, Ara.
Thanks, Kathy, and welcome, everybody. It's so terrific to have you with us at the beginning of this Bartók journey together. As Kathy said, we're happily looking at the members of the Callisto Quartet. And if you're seeing them in the same order as I am, on the left is Hannah Moses, who's the cellist, and then Eva Kennedy, who's the violist of the quartet, and then the two violinists, Paul Aguilar and Rachel Stenzel. Welcome, Callistos. It's just so great to be with you, even in this distanced form.
Thank you so much.
And I've got to say, it's just so wonderful to see four people in the same room together. Even that is, in this time of isolation, kind of a total joy. And on Sunday, we'll see four people in the same room together playing their string instruments, which is even better. But I assume you've made the decision to pod together and continue life as a quartet. Actually, why don't we start by your telling us about life as a quartet together in this strange time?
Yeah, so we're very lucky that we have been able to kind of form a quartet pod here. So we are based in Houston, and we've been able to, we have the luxury of having apartments large enough to rehearse in. And so we've been able to kind of, keep after business as usual, kind of as much as possible, and whatever that means during these times. So we were so grateful to Caramoor for letting us present this Bartók cycle, because so many of our concerts and other engagements have been canceled, and we were really kind of getting into this slump of feeling unmotivated and not knowing what kind of repertoire to work on. And when we were in discussion with Caramoor about programming, we kind of cooked up this concept, and we were immediately just so excited about it. So that's really been what's keeping us going in our little quartet pod these days. So we're so excited to go on this journey with everybody here.
The quartet was formed at the Cleveland Institute about 4 years ago, and you're now in residence at Rice University as the graduate quartet in residence, and you've racked up some nice prizes at Banff and the Fischoffs and elsewhere. Tell us about the decision so early in your life as a quartet to take on all 6 of the Bartók quartets, what that decision and what this repertoire represents. String quartet repertoire is almost infinite, so how you came to focus on the Bartóks.
Right, so actually, funnily enough, the very first piece of repertoire that we worked on as a quartet 4 years ago was Bartók string quartet number 6, which seems a little ridiculous for a brand new group to start Bartók 6 string quartet. But we were just, a new group at school, and we were part of a quartet program at the Institute where 6 quartets were actually each doing one of the Bartók quartets. So it was just such a wonderful opportunity. The very first semester we were a string quartet to be kind of immersed in a Bartók cycle of sorts with fellow students at the school. So we were able to really just start to get to know and listen every week as we went to these seminars, all of the Bartók quartets being worked on. And they really started to grow on us. We started to understand more of the language and the ideas, behind them. And so it's kind of been something that's been with us, since we started. And we hadn't actually got around to learning any other Bartók quartets until this year. We'd done a lot of 20th century work. We had recently played the Ligeti First String Quartet, which some people call Bartók's Seventh String Quartet because it's so similar in language, and we just loved that piece. But yeah, what Eva was talking about, when we had the opportunity to do this Bartók cycle, we jumped on it because we love the quartets, and we've been thinking about them and listening to them for as long as we've been a quartet. So this is just a really wonderful opportunity for us to do that, and we're so excited.
I almost automatically said journey at the beginning in the introduction, and just instinctively, I wasn't planning on saying it, but there is something about this arc of the Bartók quartets, isn't there? From 1 through 6. He was in his late 20s when he wrote the first one, in around 1908, 1909, and the last one is 1939, just on the eve of his leaving to come to America and fleeing war-torn Europe, and he was 58. What's in your experience now of living in these pieces and learning them, what do you see as the value of encountering them together as a body of work rather than in isolation?
Well, I think it's been really interesting learning and studying all of these works, because we often think of a composer's early works as something that they learned from and then improved upon later in their life. And we don't think this is true about the Bartók quartets. We think that there is definitely a journey and a progression through all of the quartets, but each one is so beautiful and such a masterpiece in and of itself. And it's really just been wonderful to study them all and see how his compositional language changes over his life, but he still brings the same concepts and emotions, of course, the folk influences, the Hungarian influences, to all of the quartets, and just to see how those things have transformed over his life.
I think just to add on to that, I mean, people who love Bartók already recognize these things, but I think one thing that really interests us about presenting the full cycle is maybe introducing some of the variety that exists in Bartók to people who might not be as familiar with the works. I think for people who are more used to a diet of kind of classical and romantic works, 20th century music kind of gets this blanket generalization thrown over it where it kind of all sounds the same. And we're really excited to be able to hopefully show some of the differences even within each individual piece, just the range that Bartók has in his compositions, and hopefully give people who are less familiar with them kind of more of an opportunity to delve into Bartók's kind of like vast variety in his compositional language.
And particularly in this program with 1, 4, and 6, we really do have so many contrasts. We have, such romanticism in the first quartet, both, melodically and harmonically. We have the Hungarian folk influences. In the fourth quartet, we have this mechanical music. We have music from nature. So much more folk influences, developed in terms of his composition at that point in the fourth quartet. And in the sixth quartet, we have really a very, emotionally, personal political statement about what he's experiencing, what the world is experiencing. And it's the combination of, respect to the old forms, but his own, take on developing that, on motivic, connections and, development, and the folk influences, and just, it's really the whole spectrum of so much of his writing. And really, there's so much that is different. But again, as Rachel said, each one is just so good. It's of the highest quality. but each one is so different. And that's really a wonderful opportunity for us when we're studying all six and presenting all six. I think we had been discussing how if we were presenting a standard concert and say we played a Haydn quartet and maybe a Beethoven quartet or a Romantic quartet and then a Bartók quartet, the Bartók would probably go in the center, and it'd be the the 20th century piece, and people would say, okay, that's what Bartók sounds like. But when we present all six, we're able to show 6 different ways that Bartók sounds, and 6 different ways for people to experience Bartók, which are all very much Bartók. You could not mistake it to be anybody else, but each one is very unique and very special.
You remind me that in the first quartet, you almost hear the language evolve over the span of the quartet. He, as we said, he was in his 20s, and the language right at the beginning, which is also colored, and we won't go into a lot of biography, but it was colored by a breakup of a largely unrequited love affair. And so the first movement is in this language that's like late Wagner, early Schoenberg, Verklärte Nacht, or Strauss. And then you almost hear his transition through the piece to the beginnings of a uniquely Bartók vocabulary. Is that something you feel or sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been it was very interesting for us to have the experience to record sort of 1, 4, and 6 back to back, because as you said, like you sort of feel as you get to the end of the first quartet, the beginnings of Bartók as he is in the fourth quartet and like very middle Bartók, and sort of that motivic development and the way that he transforms motives and his tonal language as it starts to progress becomes very striking and very familiar Bartók, I think, is what develops out of the first quartet. So it's a really very special piece to sort of kickstart the whole breadth of his compositional output.
And we've been talking about the folk influence. Let's do a little bit of a musical treat. We talk so often about the folk element in Bartók, and it's important to remember that he was one of the first real ethnomusicologists. He did field recordings with very primitive recording equipment. And as a little bit of a treat in this talk, we wanted to give you one of Bartók's actual field recordings. And in this case, the exact direct piece that resulted from that field recording, just so you can hear for yourself how what he heard in a village of a peasant singing, how that translated directly into his string music. And then we'll circle back to the place of the folk elements in the quartets. But Emily, let's begin with the first field recording. And I will say, this was probably recorded in about 1905. So take a deep breath and do a little time travel with us.
Vele énekelte Kulcsák Istvánné, Tüdök Mári, Szent Mihályból.
I have no idea, but I like to think that's the voice of Bartók identifying who's singing on his field recording. Bartók wrote a series of 44 duos for 2 violins, and many of them are direct transcriptions for strings. And here's what resulted from that particular field recording. It's the first of the duos, called Teasing Song, with Itzhak Perlman and Pinchas Zuckerman playing. So, Callistos, I wanted to ask you, to what degree does this constant hovering presence of folk music color your understanding and how you play the pieces?
So, when we talk about the folk influence of Bartók, there's a lot in the sort of the vocabulary, the nomenclature of the musical sounds and the articulations. That's where we find the connection. Of course, we know about the first syllable accentuation, which mirrors the Hungarian language, and we see so many of those rhythms, obviously in the fourth and the sixth quartet, and as you mentioned, creeping in. I think it happens just very subtly in the first movement of number one, and then as we continue in the second and third movement, that first syllable accentuation shows up more and more. And so the way that we feel those rhythms, the way that we use our bows to create different articulations, and not just the first syllable accentuation, but all sorts of other sort of phonics sounds, consonants, vowels, these sounds that are in the folk language and the folk music. But then another aspect of that is sort of just the freedom that we hear in sort of this folk music. And I think that we can all hear the freeness of the tempo when in the sung example. And that type of gestural rubato is something that is also, I think, a huge part of how we interpret that type of music.
Actually, if you don't mind, we have a couple of examples of two very different approaches to Bartók, and Hannah, this anticipates one of your many star moments in the sixth quartet, which is really rich with the most gorgeous, luscious solos. These quartets have so many, you can look at them through so many different filters and lenses. And in listening to different recordings, I just pulled out two that I think are quite different in their approach. The first is going to be by the very young Juilliard Quartet. This was a recording they made around 1950, 1949, and 1950. And I was so touched in reading up. The quartet was newly formed. Robert Mann, the legendary first violinist, was in his 20s. So the first ever complete Bartók cycle of the six quartets was played in New York City by the Juilliard Quartet in 1949 by the newly formed Juilliard Quartet, who are in the third year of their existence at that point. So you've got really great predecessors for just taking on the Bartók quartets. And the moment I've picked is in the second movement of the sixth quartet. And we'll talk at more length in a few minutes about the sixth quartet works. But this is a moment where the cello has this kind of rich motif. How would you describe it, Hannah? The cello just takes over. It's a cello outburst of huge expression.
Yeah, I mean, really, it doesn't even sound like a cello at that point anymore. It's just like sort of like a wailing kind of like incredibly vocal and just incredibly just wild colors, unlike anything I had ever heard before I played it, certainly.
And in response, especially in this recording, as you listen to it, the violist plays some of the fiercest pizzicatos ever recorded. In this recording, it's amazing the strings that stayed intact, but you'll hear the cellist in this very early Juilliard Quartet recording is Arthur Winograd, and the violist Raphael Hillier, and the violinists Robert Mann and Robert Koff. So let's go back to 1949 and hear about a minute of this cello solo. And we can take it out there. We don't want to give too much of the quartet away before Sunday. Some thoughts about that. It's fairly rhythmically strict. My take on it is that it's a very hot young American quartet playing the new music of the day. You know, it's funny you mentioned Ligeti. This sounds relatively close to Ligeti in some ways, the way they play it. In comparison, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, and particularly yours, Hannah, about the two different choices made. Here's the Hungarian quartet. The first violinist of the quartet was Zoltán Zeke, for whom Bartók wrote the second violin concerto. And this isn't the original cellist of the quartet, but he is the second cellist in the quartet's history, and his name is Gábor Magyar. Couldn't have a more Hungarian name than Magyar. And they come at it in a very different way. And this is a recording made in 1962, the same moment from the Sixth Quartet. And we can take it out there, Emily. Thanks. So, Hannah, will give pride of place to you. But your thought on two very different takes, and don't give away what choices you make, but how you hear the difference between those two.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you chose those two recordings because obviously both quartets have something very unique and very special to offer the music. That's the amazing thing, you know, I was thinking about, especially the Juilliard quartet recording, having been made just 10 years after the quartet was written, and thinking about how at that time it was just completely brand new music. There was no recording of it. And the other thought that I had as we were listening to the Juilliard quartet in particular, was actually when we played some of the Bartók for some of the school concerts for these middle school and high school kids, they all wondered what the music looked like. And you think it's all this random stuff or like random effects. But if you take a look, I mean, especially like the last movement of the fourth quartet or something like this, everything is marked out in a meter, and it actually looks like very simple music if you play it just sort of straight on the page. And so there's certainly a great amount of freedom in how you choose to interpret just how it looks on the page, and then how much of your own artistic license you want to put into the rubato and the sort of the elements that aren't explicitly marked out, and how much you want to change sort of the metric implications of everything. So I think both those recordings are absolutely fantastic, and we will learn from both sides of that.
It's 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, or umpteen ways of looking at a Bartók quartet. And Paul, you mentioned beautifully the stress on the first syllable in the Hungarian language, and in especially the Hungarian quartet's recording, the da 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 da. Really, the way that that's accented as intensely as it is a very good illustration of that. In Hungarian, Hannah's name would be Hanna Moses. So, and that I don't mean that just lightly, because I think that is a really important insight into Bartók's music. One of the loveliest things I find about the passing of tradition in generations of string quartets is kind of the linkage. And the other day when we met, we were talking about your work with various teachers and links to their teachers and their teachers and the tradition of playing the Bartók quartet. Could you talk a little about how your work with various teachers have connected you with various traditions of playing these pieces?
Absolutely. We have been very fortunate to work with Shmuel Ashkenazi from the Vermeer Quartet, who studied with Sandor Vey and knew so much about that Hungarian language of Bartók, and actually also studied with Gerhard Schultz from the Alban Berg Quartet, who studied with Sandor Vey, and actually Gerhard Schultz studied with Shmuel Ashkenazi, and then Daniel Phillips, he studied with Sandor Vey, and so all of these different connections working with those three people. You have Danny Phillips, here, who spent most of his life in New York, and in the Orion Quartet. So you have the Orion Quartet, and then you have, of course, the Vermeer Quartet and Shmuel Ashkenazi's, growing up in Israel and then coming to the States, but really having a very eclectic and international influence. And then Gerhard Schultz from Austria and from the European tradition. All of these different people studying with the same violin teacher and musician who worked through all of the Bartók quartets directly with Bartók. So it's just really incredible to see all of those direct linkages and all of the ideas that each of those, amazing musicians came up with, and being able to be a recipient of those influences. So really, we are so fortunate to have as direct a connection as we do to so many people that had absolutely legitimate experiences and knowledge about these pieces and what they meant. So that's been very, very special for us.
Were there, in your work with those teachers, were there any sort of aha moments? I'm sure there were many, but one or two that you remember in which something crystallized or how to realize something, or an insight suddenly popped and colored your understanding of a piece, and how to bring it into sharper focus?
I remember actually working on Bartók with Shmuel Ashkenazi, and this was back in high school when I was much younger. But that was certainly a very influential musical experience for me. And so many of the things that I learned, not only about Bartók, but about quartet playing, came from many of those coachings with him. And I remember learning so many things about balance, not only within the quartet and how to do that technically, but specifically for Bartók, creating different colors, different sounds, how to separate textures, and how it just really made the piece come alive. And suddenly you could hear all the different voices and the way that they interacted together. That was something that has certainly stuck with me to this day.
Well, you mentioned the sound world, so that's pretty great transition to the fourth quartet, which we should talk about. Now it's 1928. Bartók is in his late 40s. At the time of the first quartet, he'd gotten his first teaching job, and so he was at the very beginning of his career. But by the 1920s, he's a quite celebrated composer and pianist, has toured the US. And in many ways, the fourth quartet is such a defining moment in these quartets. And one of them, to me, is the way the sound world and the range of his sound world is so crystallized in this piece. Can you talk a little about that aspect of it and how it manifests itself differently in the fourth quartet, both within the quartet and relative to the quartets that preceded it?
Yeah, I think that the fourth quartet is a very special piece of music because it's, you know, just so mature and complex in how it's put together. And you have in the second and third quartets, so much exploration in terms of modality and harmony and just folk elements, and not just Hungarian folk elements. Music, really international music. He went to the Middle East, and there's a lot of influences in the second quartet in terms of that. But in the fourth quartet, you have all of these influences, but what shines throughout is just this incredible structure, a mathematical structure to the way that the work is put together. In the 5 movements, there's an arch form of a palindrome with the first and the fifth corresponding, the second and the fourth corresponding, and the central third movement. And just, I think, kind of what Hannah was talking about how well the music is constructed. I mean, when you look at it, particularly like the last movement of the fourth quartet, the 5th movement, when we were playing some of this music for school children this past week through Caramoor, people, some of the students wanted to see the music, and they're like, it sounds so weird. It sounds like it's changing meter every measure. And when you look at the music, it's in a simple time signature. It actually looks very traditional when you look how it's laid out on the page, but there's so much complexity, so much variation in how the music is put together. And so you just have this mechanical music. You also have so much music of nature. In the second movement, for example, of the fourth quartet, it's imitating insects. Bartók was an insect collector, and just it sounds like buzzing insects crawling all over the place so fast, so quietly. And yet what might be accomplished by another composer as a lot of sort of aleatoric effects is just exactly written in the most specific way. You know, if you slow it down, you see everything fits together down to the 16th note. It just absolutely goes in a certain way. So just the effects he's able to create are just incredible, and also, you know, down to the slowing it down to the slowest, pulling it apart. Everything makes sense. Everything is there for a reason, and also harmonically. One might hear Bartók and think, oh, it's just dissonant. It's just clashing. But the truth is, it's very tonal music. And the more you pull apart the harmonies and the more you examine them, there's so many interconnected relationships between things, and there's so much to dive into. And if you really take the time to put those together, I think it yields so much.
Let me just elaborate a little bit, because the structure is so carefully laid out in the fourth quartet. There are 5 movements. The first and the 5th have correspondences. There's a symmetry between the first and the 5th. The second and the 4th have different kinds of correspondences, very different from 1 and 5. And then the third movement stands at the center, and it's a rather singular expression. And you can almost look at it as an outer shell of the first and the 5th, an inner shell of the second and the 4th, and then this kind of deep interior or kernel, the seed. If you want to really get into natural analogies, I'll stop at that. So, you know, we've been using the word journey, but it does, the progression, even sort of emotionally and colored, does really feel like you're going to some sort of interior. And talk a little about the third movement. You talked about nature. The third movement takes that even another step in a way.
Right. So the third movement of the quartet is a really beautiful example of some of Bartók's night music, and just the like beautiful colors, muted colors. There's a lot of sort of stacked chord clusters,
particularly in the other three instruments, while the cello is mostly playing sort of a rhapsodic, again, very folk-based song throughout. But the colors that are created by these sort of stacking of the chords that you first hear actually in the first movement of the quartet, just this coming together of these tonalities is just, it creates just such a beautiful, ethereal, muted sound. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and a lot of what we're talking about sounds so sophisticated and so structural, but I have to say that just the sheer beauty of the invention in the third movement, Hannah referred to it rightly as night music, and that is a kind of Bartók musical fingerprint as well. He was acutely sensitized to natural sound, and sometime it would be good to hear that night music at night at Caramoor, to put it in context. But all of it illustrates in all of these pieces for me, there's this amazing sophistication and at the same time a kind of immediacy, isn't there, in these pieces, that it speaks.
I think it's been interesting. You keep mentioning this word journey, and that's something certainly we keep coming back to in each individual work and certainly over the cycle. And then also, if we just look at the span of this program between quartets 1 to 4 to 6, it really has been quite an interesting journey, and we really love the pairing of these three works. So as you mentioned earlier, in the first quartet, Bartók is dealing with this a breakup, a personal heartache of unrequited love as a young 20-year-old, or he was about 27, I believe. And that's that kind of sorrow and internal anguish is clear throughout that quartet. And in fact, it starts with a slow movement, and each of the three movements progressively gets faster and, in a sense, more agitated or excited, in a sense, all of those three movements. And then we move into the fourth quartet, which has this perfect arch form, as we've been talking about. And finally, then the sixth quartet, which we haven't touched on quite as much. But once again, we're dealing with themes of anguish and sorrow. But Bartók, at the end of his life, it's a much more nuanced and mature version of sorrow and anguish than he had at age 27. And now he's dealing with the rise of fascism and Nazism in Germany, losing his homeland of Hungary, his ailing mother who passed away, and so many much greater issues in the world and in his life. And that the way that it just wraps up at the end of that quartet is a very, very haunting bookend to this whole concert.
Well, thanks. That was a perfect transition to the sixth quartet. It's written in 1939, exactly on the cusp of the world really going to pieces. And all those other personal elements, his needing to leave Hungary, his mother's final illness and her death during the writing of this quartet. And very shortly after completing this quartet, he emigrated to the US, where he spent his last years. There's a structural element here too that ties it together. That's again both compositional but so powerfully emotional. Each movement begins with a section titled Mesto, and if you look up Mesto in an Italian dictionary, it means sad, melancholy, mournful, and it doesn't even frame, it actually sets off each movement. And one nice thing about things coming full circle, even relative to the US, the first performance of the sixth quartet took place not in Europe, but in the US, in New York City at Town Hall, by the Polish Quartet, who was a quartet closely associated with Arnold Schoenberg and his music. And the 21-year-old Robert Mann attended that performance. So all these endless links. you've been playing these quartets for school kids in and around Caramoor in this last week, and I always find that sometimes they just cut to the true content of a piece far more immediately than us adults overloaded with information. But what's that been like, and have you had any kind of striking insights from the kids about listening to these quartets?
Well, one student that we played Bartók 6 for did make the comment that she felt like the piece really encapsulated all the wild emotions of 2020. And we thought that was a pretty insightful remark. Of course, the challenges that we're facing this year are very different than the challenges Bartók was facing in 1939. But I think there's definitely some of those feelings of uncertainty and isolation and kind of global anxiety are things that Bartók was definitely feeling, and those are things that definitely will resonate with audiences today in 2020 as well.
Yeah, this music continues to speak so extraordinarily and remain so current and open to so many perspectives. I get a little obsessive, and so I've been listening endlessly to Bartók quartets in different performances, and it seems to almost always bring out the best from every quartet, because I've listened to one performance after another and said, wow, this is great. Wow, this is great. Wow, this is great. It's just kind of one of those reasons to be a string quartet, isn't it?
It's certainly something that we have felt. I mean, of course, as was mentioned, Bartók 6 was our first quartet that we learned together. And I think it's something that we could immediately really just feel like a closeness with the language. It's something that's very personal. It was a very personal piece to Bartók, and it's something that's easy to sort of sink your teeth into and really just feel all of everything that Bartók puts into it. It's very, like, everyone can feel it.
Yeah, I think there's a very visceral quality to this music, kind of across the board, and that takes different forms. But I think that's something that audiences really love, and I think that's something that we also really love about performing this music, is you can really, Bartók really kind of lays it all on the table, and so you can really kind of get to the heart of all these like really complex and visceral emotions that kind of carry through from the early 20th century to today. So that's something pretty remarkable.
And I think we'll end with that really lovely summary thought. Hannah Moses, Eva Kennedy, Paul Aguilar, and Rachel Stenzel, the members of the Callisto Quartet. It's so wonderful, even on online, to have some time together and see you all in the same room. And we're just all so thrilled to be in your company for this Bartók Quartet cycle. Thanks so much for all you're doing.
Thank you.
And we'll return to our wonderful friend Kathy Schumann to take us out for the evening.
Thank you, Ara and the Callisto, for that incredibly fascinating and illuminating discussion. I learned a lot in that, and I'm really looking forward. I've listened to recordings of the cycle. I've never heard the whole cycle in this way, so I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm so glad that you proposed this idea to do it at Caramoor this year. It's a perfect thing for a residency. So to everyone tuning in, you can hear Bartók's Quartet number 1, 4, and 6 on Sunday afternoon, November 1st at 3 p.m. It will be available for 24 hours after that. But this talk will be available throughout the season, so you can come back and listen to it again after you've heard the concert. And then we'll be back in the spring with part 2 and the other 3 quartets and another talk to delve into those. So stick with us and stay safe, everyone, and we hope to see you on Sunday afternoon. Thank you all.